Welcome, everyone, to the first panel of the day, The Delusion of the End of History, Liberal Political Visions, and the New Nationalisms. My name is Jeff Anderson. I'm a core faculty member of the BMW Center for German European Studies, and it's a great pleasure to be here. We have a wonderful set of panelists here for you. I'm going to introduce them in the speaking order, starting at your far right. We have Professor Hope Harrison, who's an associate professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University. Sitting next to her is Aviel Rochwald, professor of history here at Georgetown University. Sitting next to Aviel is Joyce Mushaben, who is the curator distinguished professor of comparative politics at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And sitting next to Joyce is Helga Welsh, who is a professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. I've asked each of the panelists to prepare a 5 to 7 minute opening set of remarks, focusing on the question of the broader significance of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. We have two historians and two political scientists, so we should get a very nice spread on these important issues. And I'd like to start with Hope, with Professor Harrison, who incidentally has just published a new book after the Berlin Wall. There it is right there. So I can't think of anyone better to kick off the panel than Hope.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here and see all of you who are interested in thinking about the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. 30 years ago today, I myself boarded a plane at Kennedy Airport in New York City, bound to Berlin via Frankfurt. And when we changed planes in Frankfurt to get the commuter flight to West Berlin, Pan Am back then, everyone was reading newspapers with banner headlines, Die Mauer ist offen. And I wondered, is my German not as good as I think it is? What is going on? And I was writing my dissertation at Columbia at the time on the building of the wall. Well, I didn't have to wonder for long. The pilot got on the intercom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't heard, the Berlin Wall fell last night and we are flying into history." So I spent 10 amazing days in Berlin, in the West, in the East, attending demonstrations, getting my own pieces of the wall, and watching them open new border crossing points with West Germans welcoming the East Germans, giving them flowers, giving them champagne, giving them money and hugs and tears, and it was really extraordinary. And in some sense, that experience is the beginning of my book that looks at how Germany has dealt with the history of the wall since then. So as a historian, I'm very interested in examining how countries deal with their past, and in this case, Germany dealing with the 28 years that the wall stood. Not surprisingly, the initial instinct was get rid of it. That was one of the chants of the people on the streets. Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. The city needed to be rebuilt, all that prime real estate in the heart of Berlin where the death strip had been. Now something much more productive could be done with it. So in those initial years when the point was to remove it and move on, most of the 96 miles of the Berlin Wall were in fact removed, leaving less than 2 miles scattered at various points in Berlin. One of the surprises to many Germans at the time, and Americans certainly come in this regard, was the interest of people to buy pieces of the wall. So one of the initial ways the Germans dealt with the history of the wall, other than getting rid of it, was selling it, the commercial aspect of it. People from all over the world, businesses, governments, wanted to buy pieces. And so you can see pieces of the wall, many here in Washington and all over the world, showing that sort of commercial aspect of it. But the desire of so many people around the world feeling that that had been a magical moment when the wall had changed from being this deadly place that symbolized the Cold War, that symbolized communism and its oppression, to suddenly magically becoming a symbol of freedom overnight. And so many people back then, and still to this day, want a piece of it to feel that they were part of it. Another approach Germany has adopted since then is an instinct to preserve parts of it. It took a while for this to happen, but there are places such as the Berlin Wall Memorial along Bernauer Straße, which is 7 blocks of the former death strip, having an outdoor exhibit and an indoor exhibit, feeling, as Pastor Manfred Fischer at Bernauer Straße said, this is an important part of our history. It must be preserved, it must be remembered, and future generations need to learn about how terrible walls can be and what Germans once did to other Germans. Another approach in Germany has been to commemorate the people who were killed at the wall. So far, they have found 140 individuals, their identities, their names, their stories, and they are preserved, their memory in a Fenster des Gedenkens, a window of commemoration, at the National Berlin Wall Memorial, showing pictures of them, and you can read about their biographies and why they decided to try to escape and sadly were not able to do that successfully. What Germans now focus on in the history of this wall, including this year, is celebrating the heroes of the fall of the wall, celebrating the courageous East German citizens who took part in the fall of 1989 in what has become called the Peaceful Revolution, which helped to bring down the wall. And for the broader significance of this moment, the way many of the mainstream German politicians, including Angela Merkel and so many others, talk about this history is as a very special, happy moment in German history that Germans can be proud of. And as we know, because of the weight of the Holocaust past, Germans haven't had a lot of those moments in contemporary history where they have felt comfortable celebrating something and when they have expressed pride in something. But beginning 10 years ago, on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, that has become much more common in looking back, particularly in talking about a sense of German identity. Germans can be good. Germans were good. Germans were active democratic citizens, taking to the streets and calling for freedom and democracy and to bring down that wall. And now in 2019, the leaders look back to that as an inspiration for young people, an inspiration at times that we live in now with the rise of new walls, with the rise of the far right. Many Germans feel it's more important than ever to remember this history as a way to inspire people now that new walls are never a good answer and that walls always have a very long, difficult legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, Aviel Rochwald.
Thank you. As the little replica sitting outside on our own Red Square reminds us, the Berlin Wall was both a barrier and a canvas. On its West Berlin facing side, after all, the wall was covered with graffiti and images that ranged from the sublime to the banal. It became a surface on which people could inscribe their demands and voice their protests, and onto which they could project a wide variety of hopes and dreams about what a world without walls might or ought to be like. In one sense, this multiplicity of imaginable post-wall universes was collapsed into just one historical reality, as the physical barrier itself was breached on this day 30 years ago. Some East German activists' dreams of reforming the GDR into a democratized socialist alternative to the capitalist Federal Republic quickly evaporated in the face of popular enthusiasm for unification. The actually lived experience of unification, in turn, as has been alluded to already, unavoidably fell short of some of the high expectations that had been attached to the undertaking. NATO did not dissolve, instead it expanded. A reformed Soviet Union did not prosper after jettisoning the Warsaw Pact satellites, instead it disintegrated. In brief, the many historical roads that could conceivably have been taken gave way to the one actually taken. On the other hand, the wall's fall itself remains a page in history which lends itself to diverse interpretations, and an event whose long-term consequences remain to be seen. Did it mark the long-term victory of liberal democratic values in Europe, or the end of a Cold War whose very pressures and constraints had played a fundamental role in the development of more inclusive and egalitarian institutions and practices in the West, even as it kept the East in thrall to oppressive one-party systems? Did it represent an opportunity not just for the expansion of NATO, but also for a reconceptualization of its mission? Or will it come to be seen as having set in motion a long-term slide towards the overextension and eventual disintegration or obsolescence of the Western alliance? Did it herald the dawn of a more open global society, or mark the beginning of a return to a multipolar world system in which the clashing interests of various polities increase the likelihood of conflict among major powers, as Secretary Hagel warned us? Was the crumbling of a wall that divided a nation merely a prelude to the creation of new walls between nations? Needless to say, there is no one clear answer to any of these questions, at least not yet. What the fall of the wall clearly did mark was the end of a Cold War system in which both the dynamics of international relations and the contours of domestic politics in the various members of the Euro-Atlantic sphere appear in retrospect to have been relatively predictable. In practice, of course, the system of the Cold War was not nearly as frozen, the rules of the game not quite as fixed as we might retrospectively imagine. There was, after all, the slight matter of the two superpowers nearly stumbling into nuclear war on a few occasions. But the heightened sense of unpredictability and uncertainty surrounding contemporary politics, both international and domestic, seems to distinguish the post-1989 era from that which preceded it. The range of potential scenarios lying ahead of us, including the realignment of alliance politics and the long-term ascendance of extremist forms of chauvinistic nationalism in countries that had once seemed solidly committed to the politics of the progressive center, seems much wider. That range seems much wider than it did in the days when the major ideological fault lines in Europe divided the continent into two separate, relatively well-defined geopolitical blocs. In many ways, this apparently chaotic version of history that we're living through now may be closer to the long-term norm than was the more structured, if high-risk standoff between the two rival ideologies, political economies, and geopolitical blocs during the era between the aftermath of the Second World War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. In that sense, 1989 did not so much mark the end of history as its resumption. And November 9th, of course, is not only the anniversary of the Berlin Wall's fall, but also of Kristallnacht, among other things. And so to apply any fixed meaning to this day of commemorations would, I submit, be premature, if not foolhardy.
Thank you, Avio. Joyce.
In May of 1989, I moved to Washington, D.C., to the AICGS in order to start a project on the impact of generational change on East German identity. I had a lot of friends in the Bundestag back then, and they all advised me there was no such thing as an East German identity. 6 months later, the wall fell and proved them all wrong. In fact, if we kind of look back to those demonstrations, the GDR citizens began their hot autumn with the chant, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. But by December of 1989, there were new people participating in those demonstrations, not as many women as had been there originally, and they began chanting, "Wir sind ein Volk," we are one people, To which a lot of Westerners began responding, "Wir auch," so are we. 1991 to 1993 saw unprecedented waves of violence against foreigners, which I am willing to argue were precipitated by Helmut Kohl's insistence Germany is not a land of immigration, and the draconian changes that had been made in asylum laws between 1983 and 1987. Let's not forget that part of the Kohl legacy. But by 1996, 62% of the Easterners felt that they had grown farther apart from the other Germans. So I am here to argue that unification, first of all, proved that Germany's adherence to a paradigm of jus sanguinis directly contradicted its own needs as a democratic polity facing a looming demographic deficit. But it also was a challenge to Germany's economic competitiveness, not to mention the solvency of its pension system, which of course are now still intricately connected to migration and integration. In fact, unification proved that a common language, shared borders, a common currency, and even a shared history do not make for a unified citizenry, because East Germans and West Germans had learned to interpret that history very differently over time. Now, I think that Germany has undergone a 180-degree turnaround over the past 30 years. It has come to accept itself as a land of immigration, integration, and heaven forbid it even sees itself as a welcoming culture. And I believe a lot of that owes to the policy changes that have been made under a woman who refers to herself as a person with migration background, Chancellor Angela Merkel. Let me just indicate a few of the changes in laws that we have seen in Germany over the last 30 years, but in particular, since the year 2005, 2008, and then a whole lot of laws being changed between the period roughly 2012 and 2014 that set Germany up for its open acceptance of the mass migrations of the refugees in 2015. First of all, we had the new citizenship law that was passed in 2000, which had a really stupid provision in it called the Optionspflicht that expected teenagers to go through a heavy bureaucratic process with all kinds of documents having been sent from the home country that they rarely ever visited. They did away with the Optionspflicht in 2014, which means that children who are born on German soil who have at least one parent with permanent residence are now German citizens, period. The asylum laws, it used to take anywhere from 2 to 5 years on average to process an asylum claim. Because of liberalizations in asylum law and because of new procedures that have been introduced, the average processing time right now is 7 months. Geduldete, people who had been denied refugee or permanent refugee or asylum status, the so-called tolerated ones, had to go get their permissions renewed every 6 months, could not get a decent job, at least not a legal one at that point. Anybody who now falls into the tolerated category in Germany, who's lived there at least 8 years, is guaranteed permanent residency. And for those who've received tolerated status prior to 2019, they can now enroll in occupational training courses and actually stay a so-called 3+2 system. Angela Merkel introduced the first National Integration Summit. She introduced a National Integration Plan and then the National Integration Implementation Plan. So she's gone about this in a very scientific way in order to improve many of the conditions so that people who come to Germany as foreigners can in fact work there and contribute to the economy. Roughly 20% of the German citizens or the German population right now have some kind of migration background. And I think sort of the icing on the cake or the Sahnehäubchen or whatever they would say over there is that at this point, 58 members of the Bundestag are people with migration background. That's a representation level of roughly 8%. Germany has changed indeed, and in my view, it has changed for the better. All of Germany, West and East. Thank you.
So
Thank you, Joyce. Helga.
I'm last, and I figured that I would be last because when I looked at the panel, my last name, Welsh, determined me to be last. And so I wondered, oh God, you know, is there anything left to say? And I think, yes, there is. Also, important ground has already been covered. And I think this is a long introduction to saying that 1989 has indeed lots of meanings. And so did 1789, which in 1989 was a common reference point. 1989, Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian, also took 1989 as the end of the short 20th century. So clearly it's a very important turning point, geopolitically, politically, and economically. It was a period of extraordinary politics, and clearly a time of euphoria, maybe too much hubris, as we have found out later, and it didn't last very long. So in Germany, already in the 1990s, we talked of the unification crisis. And if I believe accounts, some people have even argued that 1989 is probably celebrated or commemorated more in the West than it is in the countries where the revolution actually took part. Historians often refer to Berlin and Prague, the only places where there are really major commemorations. So I don't know whether that's true or not. But this brings me, and of course I should say, and of course there are many Western European countries where it's clearly not a reference point, only a very indirect one. It brings me to my first point that I would like to make, and that is what I call the unfinished business of the revolution. 1989, unfortunately, did not turn out to be a source of national identity or social cohesion in many of the former post-communist countries. Political scientists refer to this as the fractured memory regime, meaning that 1989 is remembered very differently. And I see this now in particular that when the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, during the election campaign uses slogans that says, complete the turnaround, complete the Wende, a slogan that, however, appeared much earlier in some of the East European countries, namely already in the 1990s. President Kwasniewski rightly talked about the peaceful nature of roundtable negotiations. And those of us who looked at transitions toward democracy lauded this approach very much so, and looked at Spain as a successful example of a successful transformation toward democracy. And when the Eastern European countries emulated this approach, it was seen as progress. It was peaceful, it was bloodless. However, today, in the rhetoric of populist right-wing parties that we have talked about, it is often the founding sin of kind of the new countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Fidesz in Hungary talks about it that way, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, but also the Justice and Truth Alliance in Romania. They talk about the elitist nature. And of course, they talk about it as a betrayal, as a moment of lost opportunities. But there are, of course, other narratives. And one narrative is that of nostalgia for the past. But fortunately also, and it came also a topic of discussion a little bit this morning, for many of the younger generation, it is also a topic nowadays of saying we need to reclaim the values of 1989, that what was fought for in 1989 we don't want to lose, and that's the pushback that we see in the streets of Warsaw and Budapest and Prague. And I think that's very important to remember. My second reference point is that 1989 was the peak of what has been called the third wave of democratization. So the third wave of democratization started in 1974 in Southern Europe with Portugal, with Greece, and Spain. I already mentioned Spain. And then, it traveled to Latin America, to parts of Asia. It started to peter out a little bit, but then came 1989, and then it went on, of course, until 1991. And an unprecedented number of countries tried to transform into democratization, into a democratic political system. And I think that's definitely a highlight. So However, at the same time, it did bring, and we talked about this briefly, an end to the Cold War and to the existing power balance, and it immediately also triggered armed conflict, and Yugoslavia is a prominent example. We also, I think, forgot that democratization is a long and drawn-out process, and it is not something that is easy to accomplish. And then if we take a historical approach, that most countries have had problems with democratization, and it was not a linear progression, but it won with steps forward and setbacks. In fact, if I just want to cite one recent study, if we take 1974, as I mentioned, as the starting point, and 2012 as the end point, an unprecedented number of 91 countries tried this process of democratization. But unqualified success has been very, very rare. And in fact, many have ended up in other authoritarian regimes. And we now use the term hybrid regime very often to classify those countries that are somewhere in between. The Freedom House calls it an electoral democracy. So there are, the different. So on a positive note, however, I should say that the countries in Central and Eastern Europe are the countries that have done extremely well compared to many of the other countries that were part of the third wave of democratizations. Many, very many, are in this category of flawed democracies, but the United States is also in this category of flawed democracies now, according at least to The Economist. But the rankings are, in the first 30 or 40 countries in the world. So I think that's an important accomplishment despite drawbacks. I want to just briefly mention, and then I close. I think a third point is, of course, and I'm sure we will come back to this in the discussion, is what I call the rise of neoliberalism. So it was definitely not the end of history, but it was definitely the beginning of a time when there was no alternative to capitalism. And I think that had left important implications, and I think very important implications in particular for leftist parties. If we look at Italy, the transformation of the party system in Italy followed immediately. 1989, the Communist Party disappeared. A fragmentation of the party system happened. And so some people have argued it started the kind of an identity crisis of the left. It led to the third way approach to, that Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder and Bill Clinton to some extent envisioned. But it also led, of course, to cuts in welfare benefits and austerity programs. And some of the legacies, therefore, are also ones that haunt us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions that go to the heart of the title of the panel, and I've alerted the panelists to the nature of the question, so they had a little time to think about it in advance. And several of your remarks anticipate this topic. Both of these questions go to the question of the end of history, which even President Kwasniewski mentioned in his opening remarks. There were many bold pronouncements made around the time of 1989, and Fukuyama's is probably the best known of them. And none of these pronouncements have really been borne out in any way, shape, or form in terms of the present reality. In fact, the triumph of liberal democracy, the onward march of global capitalism is no longer really a foregone conclusion, or at least these are now being contested around the world. And the question is, how did we get to this point? Did the fault reside in the prognosticators? Did people like Fukuyama misread the situation, misread the point in history where we were back in 1989? Or are we talking about potentially lost opportunities? Mistakes were made somewhere between 1989 and the present that saw these hopeful visions of a future disintegrate. Maybe we could start in reverse order. Helga, would you like to take that up first?
Okay, I can. So, obviously the end of history, I think there never is an end to history, right? I think that's probably the first thing to say. And I think clearly it was overly optimistic. and it introduced an element of triumph, a triumph in the West. The West won and the others lost. And I think this left, to this feeling of there is no alternative. There's no alternative to neoliberalism. There's no alternative to shock therapy, the Washington Consensus in terms of an economic program. But it also led to the expectation that, that democracy would be part of the process and the end result. And I think that, of course, was a triumph that did not pan out. And I think if we would have looked at history, we would have known that those processes are long, as I mentioned, long and drawn out processes. So we overestimated the triumph and we underestimated the difficulties. And again, going back to what President Kwasniewski said, is we also had no blueprint. That it came as a surprise. It came as a total surprise. And so therefore, what was being emulated was the West. And the West felt it didn't need to change. And I think that's also an issue. If we just look at Germany, for example, Western Germans didn't really think that unification would mean any transformation of their lives, but it turned out, and of course it wasn't, not nearly as dramatic as in the East, but it nevertheless was a transformation. So I think this moment of triumph, I think, led to mistakes.
Interesting, yes. Joyce?
I will concur that this moment of triumph thinking was wrong, that it introduced the concept of winners and losers, but I also tend to reject analyses such as this to begin with because they're meta-analyses. They're sort of systemic, structural analyses, and I have made my reputation and built my academic publication list based on spending a lot of time on the ground. And I can talk a lot about why it is that East Germans still feel like second-class Germans after 30 years. So I think that by looking at whose system won, we're not really looking at the very differentiated picture of who are the winners, who are the losers. In fact, I can argue now, even though East German women were definitely the losers, winding up as 59% of the unemployed and having all these support benefits and programs taken away from them. If we now look at the policies in Germany that have been adopted under various Merkel regimes, there's been a practical restoration of subsidized childcare, of guaranteed, of extension to paternity leave as well as maternity leave. And so now it appears that West German women and East German women are kind of the ultimate winners of unification, given the many policy changes that have come to bear on Germany since 2007. So I think if we don't look at what's happening on the ground, these meta-analyses don't do me and my kind of research a lot of good.
Thank you. Avio?
I would echo many of these themes. The theme of hubris maybe sort of is an umbrella term that captures many aspects of these processes, and some degree of hubris was probably unavoidable. It's unrealistic to imagine that leaders in the West and elites in the West would not have indulged in some following this sort of bloodless triumph over the communist foe globally and in Europe. But I mean, but this took some concrete forms. It took the form of an open-ended process of NATO expansion, and I mean clearly, the extension of the security umbrella to and the inclusion in it of countries like Poland and Hungary was an important reversal of historical abandonments in earlier decades and centuries. But in my opinion, it was a mistake to leave the door open to a potentially infinite number of expansions without coordinating in some ways with or negotiating over it in some substantial way with Moscow. And I think that played into the hands of Putin, and now it's sort of he is not to be appeased, but the the elements that helped empower him included, I think, some strategic short-sightedness, reflective of hubris on the part of NATO leaders, and the end of the Cold War brought with it this assumption that, I think there was a working assumption that fascism didn't need to be worried about anymore because it had been defeated within, what was still living memory for many leaders at the time, and sort of marginalized in Western society. And now Marxism was no longer a concern because it had been defeated. And so that reinforced the pre-existing tendency, already strong in the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher, of taking the working class and the subalterns of society, however you want to classify them, for granted, and busting unions, be it PATCO or the coal miners or public service unions, a process that continues in this country to this day, and sort of letting go of the kind of the broader interclass coalition that had seemed so important to maintain in the eyes of, Eisenhower Republicans and Democrats alike in this country during the Cold War. Now we didn't need to worry about winning over the underclasses, and that was a mistake, as was the myth that the end of the Cold War marked the triumph of the market, when in fact economically it marked the triumph of the mixed economy. But that was not the slogan and the myth that emerged, and that then played into this cult of neoliberalism that has already been alluded to.
Very good. Hope.
Yes, the end of history. Well, of course, there were real people living in Germany, real people in the East, and history didn't suddenly end. They didn't suddenly become probably the wealthy West Germans that they thought they would overnight, particularly when Chancellor Kohl promised blooming landscapes, blühende Landschaften in the East. And so some of these people have considered themselves victims since the fall of the wall, as opposed to thinking of victims of the Berlin Wall. That is a minority, but they have become louder. And of course, anniversaries, commemorative events on anniversaries, such as today's 30th anniversary, attract attention to historic events. Now, over time, those commemorative events have been meant to unite nations around a certain view of history, around a particular historical event. But they can just as well divide people. They can expose cleavages in how people are thinking about that event. And I argue that since 2009, the German leaders have tried to create basically a new founding narrative, a new founding myth of united Germany, being born out of the peaceful revolution of 1989, putting Germany in the community of nations it has long wanted to be a part of, nations with democratic revolutions as their founding moments. But there are a variety of problems with that myth, as there are with all founding myths. For one thing, a lot of West Germans don't buy into it, since for so many West Germans, their lives didn't change a lot, particularly if they didn't have family or friends in the East. Maybe their lives haven't changed much since the fall of the wall. And in terms of satisfaction with unification, there's much more satisfaction in the East than there is in the West. There's resentment on the part of some people in the West at all the investment that has been put into the East, over 2 billion euros since the fall of the wall. Since the economic situation in the East was far more challenging than people understood at the time. There has been increased scrutiny in recent months of Treuhand, the government organization in the 1990s that Germany put in place to privatize all of the state industries and to really deal with the East German economy. And that found, not surprisingly, that many of them were inefficient and put them out of business and put millions of people out of work. And there's renewed scrutiny now of that organization and of that history on the part of some in the East who feel that there hasn't been enough attention paid to this difficult transition they have had to make from communism to a market economy and generally to democracy. Of course, young people born since the fall of the wall are much, much less affected by this. And I think for them, the story of 1989 and the fall of the wall, bringing everyone together, makes more sense. They can't imagine how could there have been a wall to begin with. And there have been more and more interesting memoirs coming out of East Germans trying to understand the role their parents played in the old regime and what life was like. But it's worth bearing in mind that 76% of Germans are proud of what happened in 1989. 70% of East Germans feel that they gained with unification. But when asked, do you feel more East German or do you feel more German? 47% of people in the East feel more East German, whereas 44% of them feel more German. On the West, it's very different. 71% of them feel German. So this is an ongoing process in this country growing together, which began, of course, in some important ways with the fall of the wall 30 years ago.
Very good. So my second question has to do with the notion of events. I mean, we're looking at a seminal event, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It symbolizes or stands in for a large number of comparable events that were taking place in that part of the world at that time. And so 1989 has come to mean something. It meant something at the time. It stood for a set of not just event or accomplishments, but also values, a set of hopes. And those meanings have changed over time, that is, ever since. And my question has to do with subsequent events. I mean, are we looking at a set of meanings that are attached to 1989 that have slowly changed in a gradual sort of evolutionary process since that date? Or has our understanding of that event and what it symbolizes changed because of subsequent events? I mean, I guess this is in the category of history is one damn thing after another, and it didn't stop in 1989. I'm thinking of the Balkan tragedy, which was mentioned earlier, or 9/11, which certainly changed the frame of reference here in the United States away from 1989 and to a different set of concerns and a different set of understandings. More recently, the financial crisis and its searing impact on society and politics in Europe. Not necessarily asking you to go through the full range of things that have happened since then, but perhaps select one or two events that you think really have, subsequent events that really have changed our framing of 1989 and its meaning. Hope, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, you mentioned 1989 throughout Central Europe, and one thing that it has been interesting to watch is when most people in the world, when they talk about 1989, and certainly people in the US, they think about the fall of the wall, that sort of symbolized the end of the Cold War and the end of communism. The Poles and the Hungarians are very frustrated with this narrative that focuses on the wall, pointing out, as President Kwasniewski did earlier today, of course, it was Polish roundtable talks that came before that. Hungary opened its barbed wire border with Austria before that. So, even thinking just about the events of 1989, there's some differences in emphasis among these countries. Now, the Germans have done their best to integrate all of these narratives. Starting with President Gauck in 2014, he invited the leaders of Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia to join him to celebrate the 25th anniversary. And in fact, they went to all 5 of their countries on key events such as June 4th with the elections in Poland to sort of expand that memory beyond just the fall of the wall, but recognize Germany was part of a broader community going through revolutions in 1989. President Steinmeier this year has continued that. Today, those leaders of Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia are with President Steinmeier and Angela Merkel. They were together at the Berlin Wall Memorial today. They'll be at the Brandenburg Gate. So there has been an effort on the part of the Germans to recognizing that around the world, the global memory focuses on the drama of the fall of the wall, but that was part of a bigger story. But the aspect of that, the peaceful revolution in East Germany and people taking to the streets to call for democracy, what's happened since then, for example, in Germany and elsewhere, even in the United States, is you also see people on the far right with the AfD saying, yeah, we too are taking to the streets. We too are expressing our views as active citizens. And so when you open up this attention to sort of the power of populism and engaged citizens, not just sitting back and accepting things, but making their voices heard, you open a much broader range of possibilities than just the people who are fighting for open borders and human rights and democracy. There can be a variety of agendas that are followed, and that's certainly what we've been seeing in Central Europe and certainly in parts of the east of Germany.
I mean, that's a sobering reflection, and it points to the importance of engaging in the struggle to interpret historical events and to define their latter-day meanings, which are inherently fluid and not objectively fixed. I haven't pursued the study of how 1989 is commemorated or remembered across European countries, but I have a sense that if in the immediate aftermath of the events of that year, the prevalent response in much of the West was, much of the Western establishment was an attitude of hubris, President Bush's sort of self-restraint notwithstanding. This, I think, is itself a framing of the event that necessarily needs to be revisited, and so it's important not to let the sort of the new far right appropriate or misappropriate the legacy of 1989 for its own purposes, but in order to contest that appropriation, I think those on the progressive side of the political spectrum need to sort of redefine 1989 not as a sort of once and for all paradigm shift from authoritarianism to democracy, although it's obviously had those elements, but to look to it for inspiration for latter-day movements. The even sort of revolutions that manifestly failed, like the 1848 revolutions in Europe, did not cease to be points of inspiration for veterans of those revolutions and for subsequent generations of progressive activists on both sides of the Atlantic. Some of the most prominent progressives in this country, fled Germany and Central Europe after the suppression of the 1848 revolutions. 1989 was a much more successful paradigm shift than 1848. And so I think all the more so, even as we avoid sort of a misplaced sense of sort of sanctimonious accomplishment associated with 1989, we can sort of reframe it as a point of inspiration, as a suggestion of what is possible when, as has been described to us, civil society organizes itself and finds its voice. And as such, I think we can draw a connection between the events of 1989 and movements today, be it in Hong Kong or in Chile or in Beirut or, God willing, in Washington, D.C.
Joyce.
I would like to take a couple of these events and relate them to Germany's changing place in the world. I certainly think the 2+4 agreement that restored German national sovereignty was not something Germans were thinking about sort of in military consequences back in 1990, but the Balkan Wars brought another paradigmatic shift when Joschka Fischer, the first Green foreign minister, sits there and debates with himself how to deal with two precepts of post-war German foreign policy that had always been spoken as a single sentence, never again war and never again Auschwitz, and has to suddenly come to terms with never again war, meaning no attacks on the Serb forces or allowing the genocide to persist in Kosovo, would mean, in fact, tolerating another kind of Auschwitz. So this starts the Germans thinking that, yes, maybe it is time for them to start assuming a much more active defensive role. But I think then the events of 9/11 prove that you're not going to be able to fight conventional wars anymore. And so it's not just Germany being required or demanded of Germany that they play a much more active military role in the defense of democracy, but they have to start doing this at a point in time when nobody's going to be fighting conventional wars anymore. You have to have all kinds of cybersecurity things. This is coming at a point where Germany has just shifted to a volunteer army. The European Court of Justice says you have to let women into combat roles. It's facing a demographic deficit. It's got all kinds of stuff going on at one time, and then Angela Merkel appoints, heaven forbid, a female defense minister who's supposed to deal with this modernization. A second point that I think is very important here with the ascension of Angela Merkel to the chancellorship. Remember, she is not a person who grew up with the European Union. She had not grown up looking towards France as Adenauer, Helmut Kohl, and Helmut Schmidt and all those other people had. But she had always been more attracted, was more familiar with the East. She's the one person on the European stage who can keep Putin engaged in some kind of a dialogue, and I think he appreciates that. But the other thing that starts happening as of the Euro crisis is the breaking up of the sacrosanct Franco-German relationship, because she and Mr. Bling couldn't get along together. She had very little confidence in the economic management skills of an Hollande, and I don't think that she and Macron are the best of friends at this point either. So those events have come together in different ways to redefine Germany's position in the world and what kinds of questions it now has to ask itself.
So I agree, and I want to also start with the Balkan Wars. So here we have this euphoria, and we think there has not been a war in Europe, and then war breaks out almost immediately after 1989. And the response was mostly, at least initially, it's kind of the outbreak of old age hatreds. They have always existed, blame the past. And I think we didn't look enough at kind of the manipulation by, now we would call them populist nationalists like Milosevic and Tudjman at the time. And I'm using this as an example to say that what happened in Eastern Europe or in Central and Eastern Europe often was blamed on the legacy of communism instead of looking at what goes on at the moment. And I think the 1990s were a very crucial decade in that regard. And in fact, many people do point to kind of the dislocation and the changes in the 1990s as part of understanding what goes on today. The Balkan Wars also showed the disunity of the Western European countries and the need for US leadership. So it reinforced once again the importance that maybe NATO was not an obsolete alliance, because you could say the Warsaw Pact has been dissolved, so why do we still need NATO? It showed once again how important alliance structures are and the need for leadership. I think that's an important part, and it may also have had some implications for reinforcing this idea of the Maastricht Treaty of a common foreign and security policy, that it should be more than just a piece of paper. Maybe I want to kind of jump briefly to the financial crisis. I think the financial crisis was another intensifier of processes already underway. Of course, it affected the countries very differently. Hungary particularly hard, Poland also, but less so than other Central and East European countries. The economy was more robust. But it created new anxieties and new fears after a period of anxieties and uncertainty and fears that many East Europeans had hoped had just escaped, or also many Germans. To think about the 1990s, I think of it as a kind of a decade of uncertainty, of anxiety. We all know, to take examples that Joyce probably normally would give, is the drop in the birth rate, for example. In East Germany alone, the birth rate had dropped to half of what it used to be in East Germany, to a record 0.84, which I think is an enormous indicator, kind of an unobtrusive indicator about the fear of the future. And when things just started to get settled again, then new elements of uncertainty were introduced, and of course then intensified by first the financial crisis and then the euro crisis.
I have a different interpretation of that plunging birth rates.
Okay.
Look at the demographic statistics. 1989-90 marked the end of a 20-year birth cycle in East Germany. Women had their children between the ages of 19 and 23. If you look when the baby booms were in the 50s and the 70s and the 90s. So I think that there was a kind of natural drop-off, but then, of course, 52% of the 4 million people who left the eastern states after unification were female and better educated females, leaving Mecklenburg-Vorpommern looking like those poor Norwegian bachelor farmers at Lake Wobegon, right?
So I agree with you, but I would also say we saw this trend all over Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, so probably both explanations.
I'll go with that.
And on the Eurozone crisis, Jeff, let me say, of course, that's when the AfD was formed. Right. By Western economists and professors who didn't want to be bailing out other countries, wanted to just be focusing Germany's economy on itself. And of course, the foundation of that party is so important. It would shift drastically from focusing on Eurozone issues with the refugee crisis to focusing on refugee issues and ultimately becoming really kind of a party of protest in the East. So the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis are essential to understanding a major development in Germany.
This is why you should keep professors out of electoral politics, I think. I think we have plenty of food for thought out there and about 25 minutes worth of Q&A, so I'll take questions in groups of 3. I'll start with Dieter here.
Thank you very much. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Great panel. Thank you very much. 2 points. One is the term revolution came up. Everybody mentioned it here. And I wonder how applicable is the term revolution, understood as a change or replacement of order, creating a new one. Well, at best, it's a half one, right? I mean, it was revolutionary on the eastern side, not on the western side, right? I think it's a little hard to use revolution. Maybe the term you used, Helga Bisch, the third wave of democratization, that probably is closer to reality and to the evolution of the process. But the second point is more important to me, which is how foreseeable was all this. And President Kwasniewski mentioned it, how surprised they were in Poland when Kohl was there and all of a sudden the wall fell. Sure, I mean, big surprise what to do. And for statecraft, it's of course big puzzle what to do. But if I'm not mistaken, Andrei Almarik wrote a book in the early 70s. Can the Soviet Union survive 1984? And I think that's important because it shows that here was a totalitarian one-party system imposed on a multi-ethnic society and run, with a one-party state. How long can this work? And we should have known better, I think. We didn't because we had to paint the Soviet Union as a big, powerful organization with a lot of military power behind it that needed, a lot of effort on our side, and to paint the Soviet Union as weak and vulnerable would not have worked very much to organize our own defense, right? So we have been caught practically in a perception that was not totally realistic. And looking at the Soviet system as it collapsed, I mean, it had all the weaknesses, the seeds of its own collapse right there that we were somehow prevented to recognize. So I think we need to rethink a little bit how foreseeable it was. Thank you.
Katja?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentations and the discussion. One element that often comes up in studies of democratic transition, which all of you spoke to, is the question of justice when you look back at the past. And you haven't really discussed that very much. One of my predominant memories of the early 90s is of these incessant talk show trials on West German TV where East Germans were constantly and as a group accused of having supported an authoritarian state. And they were all, on the basis of Stasi revelations, accused of an authoritarian mentality, and all these memories of civil discontent and protest were wiped away in these accusations. Nonetheless, I think it is very important, and this, we've seen this throughout the 90s with Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, for instance, that societies in transition had to find various modes of coming to terms with egregious infractions of human rights, persecution, and how to determine whether you want to do an amnesty kind of program like they did in South Africa and say, let's speak the truth, but then bury it and let bygones be bygones, or actually prosecute what happened. Can you speak a little bit more, maybe either in the East German case or the German case, or comparatively across Eastern Europe, how, in your view, this has gone?
Young man right here.
This year is the 30 years anniversary of the democratization of the Eastern Europe countries. But it's also the 30 years anniversary of the failed democratic protests in China. And through the years, we can see that although the third wave democratization succeeds in many post-communist countries, but we also observe that many of the post-communist countries, such as the Russia and China, and they become authoritarian state. They continue as an authoritarian state and fail to democratize. And many of the countries in the rest of the world are remain at the totalitarian countries, such as North Korea, and many of the states in Islamic world, such as Iran, after the revolution in 1979, they retain as the theocratic states. So, do do you think the third wave democratization, or in general, democratization, will finally spread to those countries? And in what way would you imagine that happen?
Three big questions. So, Joyce, would you like to kick it off?
I'm going to go with the transitional justice question. First of all, because of this triumphalism, right? The first thing that happens on the Western side is what? The Bundestag Enquete Commission, it has to investigate the consequences of the SED dictatorship. And if you look at who participated in that inquiry, those cards were stacked. The deck was stacked from the very beginning in partisan terms, in terms of the people they brought in terms of the questions that they asked. And I came from this panel yesterday in Seattle. It's been a very short night, and it will be a very long day, where there were 3 people from East Germany on the panel, and they said, you know, all these, I was 8, my brother was 12, all these people were hammering on us about the dictatorship, and we had a nice life. Most of us were not caught in the web of the Stasi stuff. We were, yeah, we missed, you know, having certain goods and things like that, but we don't understand why everybody was blaming us for the dictatorship. We were doing what you just had to do to get along. So I think it's a little too late for that kind of transitional justice, but where it gets reflected among the East Germans who still feel like they're not being treated like real Germans is looking at the elite statistics. 80% of the privatized property from the Treuhand went to West Germans. Only 6% went to East Germans. 1.7% of all elites are mostly Western. Westerners dominate as media elites. They dominate the corporations. Only 5% of the R&D money is being channeled into the eastern states. So it's not so much working out what happened then, it's waiting 30 years for a little bit of equitable distribution that I think would go much farther in making East Germans feel like they're really a part of the system. And I do have to contest Hope's point a little bit. I think West Germans have changed fundamentally, but it's kind of like, you know, the frog in the boiling water. The changes for them were much more gradual, and so they don't perceive themselves now as being very different Germans than they were 30 years ago because of all these policy changes, whereas East Germans had no alternative but to simply give up their old life and give up their interpretations of the world practically overnight in order to get any of the benefits of that new system.
Hope?
Yeah, I'd also like to answer about the transition question and dealing with the past, which is something I deal with a lot in my book. It's really important to remember that the East Germans started the process of grappling with the past and going after people who had been in the Stasi. They started the process of wanting to bring to trial people who were involved in killing others at the Berlin Wall. So the fall, winter of 1989-90, these processes of transitional justice were begun in East Germany. And they were then continued in West Germany. In terms of the Enquete Commissions, again, it was East Germans who pushed very hard for those and who served as the head of those. Now, yes, West Germans jumped on board as well, you know, favoring this very critical view of the East as a dictatorship, but it was also former members of the opposition in East Germany that really favored that kind of language about East German being a dictatorship. On the issue of transitional justice, of course, Germany is different from all the other post-communist countries because East Germany didn't stay its own country. It didn't get to run this process on its own. It's been United Germany that has done that. And if West Germans still dominate all the elite structures now, they dominated them even more, you know, starting in 1990. And obviously the trials, the judges, the lawyers, the state prosecutors were, of course, all West Germans because they had been trained in the West German system. So even in the trials of the leaders and the border soldiers, where some people in the East ultimately ended up saying, this is victor's justice, but it was people in the East that started those trials, people who felt that who lost a family member, who was killed at the wall, something I also write about at length. Dieter's question about the term revolution. And how apt is it? It depends what time frame you're talking about. If you're talking about 1989 into the beginning of 1990, it is absolutely apt. The SED was removed from power. There were free elections in March of 1990, in a democratic way. As far as I think many East Germans are concerned, it was absolutely a revolution. What came next was different. I mean, that, unification is different. And so many people in the East are very frustrated at the conflation that a lot of people in the West make between the process of the peaceful revolution, getting democracy, bringing down the wall, carried out by people in the East, was one process, which they call a revolution. What happened after that, that ultimately led up to unification, is related but different.
I would say on the theme of transitional justice and historical memory, I'd like to call attention to another dimension of that, which is that in many East European countries, the transition away from communism and towards an open society in the 1990s brought with it a novel confrontation with the legacy of collaboration and complicity in war crimes on the part of segments of the population during the Second World War. I mean, Poland offers a dramatic example of that. This is a story in which President Kwasniewski had an honorable and distinguished role, and he can speak to this with much more authority than I can. But if I understand correctly, the Polish government established an institute of national remembrance, which had both a sort of scholarly research arm and a prosecutorial arm, designed to examine and prosecute, malfeasance and abuse of rights and so forth under the communist regime. But one of its first major tasks, as it turned out, ended up being the investigation of the atrocity in the now notorious case of the town of Jedwabne, following the German seizure of that region in the summer of 1941, and that unleashed that, in conjunction with the publication of Jan Gross's book and the controversy and debate that ensued, unleashed a clash of views and interpretations that is very much alive to this day. And I take that just as emblematic of a process that, to varying degrees, manifested itself in a variety of East European countries. So they began to grapple with some of the issues that the French, for instance, had begun to grapple with in the 1970s and 80s, and of course continued to this. These are not finite processes. So with a certain lag time, 1989 unleashed some of these debates in Eastern Europe, and they were and have become ever more politicized debates that have turned into sort of incendiary devices in the hands of the far right that is contesting the legacy of 1989, in part, among other things, by contesting the revisionist history of wartime complicity in Nazi atrocities. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
So, since I know Dieter Detke well, I think I can start with kind of a joke about the revolutions. So some people have said revolutions are like earthquake. Nobody can predict them, but everybody can explain them afterwards. So I think revolutions do have this element of surprise. Yes, we can say the Soviet Union was weak, and here I come to China, but then we look at Tiananmen Square. So one could say, if Gorbachev would not have changed his approach to politics, not bringing down the mass demonstrations in his own country, not allowing the Eastern European countries to go their own way. He used the song of the Sinatra doctrine, right? Everybody can do it their way, and he did. But I remember when this doctrine was first expressed, and I thought, well, wait, whether that's actually true. I think we underestimated the weakness of the Soviet economy, I think, in the West. I think that may have contributed to it. But I also vividly remember that there were surveys in West Germany, and people were asked, do you expect that unification will happen in your lifetime? And I think over 90% said no, right? So I think, yes, you're right. I think maybe we should have seen some of the signs, but we didn't interpret them. And I think a crucial part is the lack of force, right? And that, of course, makes the revolutions of 1989, with the exception of Romania, also what some people called a curious revolution, because normally we associate with revolutions bloodshed and not just regime change and mass demonstrations. I want to pick up some of the points with regard to Germany. Yes, East Germans voted for unification, and initially it seemed like, also very eager to just take over the Western institution, the transfer of Western institution. I think there was this feeling of there's a window of opportunity and we need to act quickly. And I think this also meant a return to the proven. That is, in hindsight, we can say it may have been a mistake that no new constitution was written, that it was just, again, an elite commission that discussed changes, and the changes were relatively minor, for most people not even kind of noticeable. But I think that's, again, an element of hindsight. At the time, you probably would not have found the support, certainly not in the West, and probably not in the East, for a lengthy negotiated process. So, of course, the transfer of institutions took also place with many problems. They were adjusted, but overall did take root. So it's a mixed picture. I'm going to just very briefly say something to transitional justice. I think, without going into too much detail, which I'm in this case prone to do because that's my area that I have studied a lot, but I think transitional justice that is how to deal with the past, is always contested, no matter how you do it, and it never goes away. I think those are two aspects. And you also have to find, ideally, a balance between three aspects. One is justice, another one is truth, and the third one is reconciliation. But they also are in tension with each other. And so therefore, to find kind of an ideal solution, I think, is almost impossible. And the West German or the German example, I agree with Hope very much, that the East Germans were a driving force, but of course they found willing supporters in the West. And some people have argued that those in the West also kind of wanted to make up for the mistakes after World War II, where there was not a thorough denazification. And this does not take away, I totally agree with you, that in the 1990s there was way too much talk about the Stasi, and it tainted the picture of East Germans by many in the West. Now, just a few words about China. So, I think when it comes to China, books have been written about the fact that if there's an economic crisis in China, then it will also end up having to go the path of democratization. I do not foresee that in the immediate future, because we have seen that the Communist Party in China, and certainly under its current leader, Xi, has had a very calibrated, if I call it that way, system of adapting the authoritarian regime to different circumstances. First, it was under Deng Xiaoping opening up the economy, leading to an enormous rise in the GDP, but also to an enormous rise in inequality in China, of course. So that's a major aspect to keep in mind. And now more and more, it's also the return to nationalism as an effective strategy. And I think the combination of economic deliverance and nationalism will work for some time in China.
Aviel, did I see you?
I was going to make a similar comment about the Chinese question. I don't know what will happen, but echoing what we just heard, Rana Mitter, Oxford historian, has made the argument that effectively China under the CCP today is a kind of a realization of what the Kuomintang nationalists aspired to make of China back in the 1930s and 1940s. In other words, it's not really a communist society, even though the party that leads it is called communist. Nationalism has become one of the foundations, legitimizing bases of the party's authoritarianism and monopoly on power, and its authoritarianism in part is motivated or rationalized by pointing to the example of the Soviet Union's disintegration and the fear that democratization in China will lead to a similar process. And we can see that playing out in vis-a-vis Hong Kong right now, in which the unrest in Hong Kong is being contained ideologically and politically, in part by portraying it as being secessionist in orientation and thus ultimately a threat to the rest of China, rather than a model that people in other Chinese cities might think of emulating.
Very good. So we're pushing right up against 1:15, so unfortunately I don't think we have time for another round of questions. So I would just ask you to join me in thanking our distinguished panel for a wonderful session.